Kenyatta presented some of the guests to the Duke and Mr. Sands. An epoch of
60 years ago, Kenya was born free. No colonial master, no foreign flag, just a people and a promise. But today, Kenya owes approximately $91 billion in terms of debts. That is more than every Kenyan earns in 2 years. And every single day, before a road is built, before a teacher is paid, and before a patient is treated, Kenya pays its creditors first. This is not an accident. This is not mismanagement. This is a system, and the system was designed to work exactly like this. I am Damberi Yusuf, and this is a debt trap. Kenya had just been independent for exactly 1 year. The ink on the constitution was barely dry. And on December 17, 1964, Kenya signed its first national loan. And who was the lender, you may ask? It was the World Bank. On the surface, it made total sense. Kenya had inherited a broken economy from the British. No real industry, no manufacturing base, just tea, coffee, and land that had been stolen and handed back unevenly. The new government needed money to build a country, so it approached the World Bank and it borrowed.
The Articles of Independence were handed by the Duke to the country's...
Under Jomo Kenyatta, the first president of the Republic, Kenya's early debt was modest. Borrowing was selective. The economy grew slowly, mostly on the back of agricultural exports. But then came the 1980s, and everything changed.
And Kenya ceased to be a colony.
Daniel Arap Moi was president. Kenya was running out of money, and the International Monetary Funds came knocking with a solution. They called it a structural adjustment program. It sounded technical, bureaucratic, and harmless, but trust me, it was none of these things. To keep receiving these loans, Kenya had to agree to conditions: cut government spending, privatize state companies, open markets to foreign competition. The loans kept coming, but so did the suffering. Here's a part that nobody will ever tell you. Every loan taken to fix the last problem created the next one. Kenya has been now on the debt treadmill, and it has never gotten off since the very time. Here's something that most Kenyans don't know. Every time Kenya takes a new loan, Parliament is supposed to approve it. It says so in the Constitution. The National Treasury proposes the borrowing. The President signs it. Then the Parliament oversees the loan. That is how it is supposed to work. But in real life, this is not the case. Critics and budget analysts over the years have been repeatedly raising alarms that the Parliament routinely rubber stamps borrowing requests with minimal scrutiny. Billions are approved. The debates in those houses are so minimal, and the people who ask these questions are very few. But it gets more complicated. You have to understand that not all loans are equal. We have two types of loans. The first loan is called the concessional loans. These are loans got from the World Bank and the International Monetary Funds. They come with lower interest rates, sometimes going as low as 1 or 2%. They also have long repayment windows, and they are actually relatively manageable. Then we have the commercial loans. From international banks, private investors, and Eurobonds carry market interest rates. They are higher and they have shorter repayment windows, and they are far more dangerous, to be honest. And Kenya, for the recent years, have been increasingly shifting towards the commercial borrowing. Now, what is a Eurobond? In simple terms, it is Kenya going to international investors and saying, lend us money, we'll pay you back with interest in 10 years. So, when Kenya is seen as stable, investors lend cheaply. When doubt creeps in, the interest rates spike. And Kenya has been paying those spikes for decades now. Now, you might really ask yourself, who does Kenya really owe? The world banks hold the largest share. That is over 1.5 trillion Kenyan shillings. The International Monetary Fund roughly holds Kenya a total debt of 420 billion Kenyan shillings. You might ask about China. China holds approximately 16% of Kenya's external debt. That number matters more than it looks. And the story behind it is one of the most controversial chapters in Kenyan modern history.
President Uhuru Kenyatta has once again tabled a defense for the standard gauge railway, saying the line is having a favorable impact on the economy.
In 2013, the people were promised a new Kenya.
Previously, to deliver one container from Nairobi to Mombasa would cost an average of 60,000 shillings. Today, we are able to deliver that container for 17,000 shillings. That is a direct saving.
The promise was simple and seductive. A modern railway running from Mombasa to Nairobi. It would be fast, efficient, a symbol of a new Kenya. The price tag was over 5 billion Kenyan shillings. And who was the lender, you may ask? China's Export-Import Bank. Phase 1 alone of the construction cost around $2 billion. Phase 2 added another 1.4 billion. These were not soft concessional loans. They were commercial rate loans with strict repayment timelines. And here's why the story gets dark. Questions emerged almost immediately. How was a Chinese contractor, China Roads and Bridges Corporation, selected? Was there open international tendering? Investigative reports and audit findings pointed to inflated contract costs and a process that raised serious transparency concerns. Then came the rumor that shook the country. The port of Mombasa had been used as a collateral. The claim spread so fast that if Kenya couldn't repay, China could take the port. East Africa's most vital economic gateway, gone. Researchers at the China Africa Research Initiative investigated the claims thoroughly. They found no evidence that the port was formally listed as a collateral in the loan agreement. Both governments denied it, but here's what the story reveals. The loan contracts themselves were never made public. Kenya signed a $1 billion agreement with China, and the Kenyan people were never allowed to read them. In 2025, Kenya was still servicing Chinese debt, budgeting nearly 130 billion Kenyan shillings for Chinese loans repayment in a single financial year. As the train ran, the debt runs faster. You may ask where this money goes, but most of it is wasted in corruption. Let me break it down. In the highlands of Elgeyo-Marakwet County, two dams were supposed to rise, the Arol Dam and the Kimurel Dam. The government borrowed billions of them, contracts were signed and money was moved. But the dams were never built, billions gone. The Arol and Kimurel Dams scandal became one of the most brazen examples of loan-funded corruption in Kenyan history. Borrowed money, vanished, no infrastructure, no accountability.
When the money was lost. And even if money was lost, people should be taken to court.
But this is not an isolated case. It is a pattern. The World Bank has reported that interest payments alone absorb approximately 1/3 of Kenya's tax revenue. Read that again. 1 shilling in every 3 that Kenyans pay tax does not build a road, does not hire a nurse or maybe feed a child, or maybe build a school. It actually goes to creditors.
How can you suddenly become very clever?
In the 2024-2025 financial year, Kenya's total debt service, principal plus interest, was around 1.72 trillion Kenyan shillings. Compare that one to the national health budget. Compare that one to the spent on public schools. The numbers do not lie. Kenya is not developing with borrowed money. Kenya is surviving, despite the fact that you are borrowing a lot of money. In April 2021, Kenya signed a 3-year agreement with the International Monetary Funds. That was around $2.34 billion in terms of debt. And what were the conditions? Raise more revenue, cut the spending, remove subsidies, and expand the tax base. So imagine it this way. Fuel subsidies had to be removed, cooking gas subsidies cut, maize flour subsidies eliminated, and the government called it a fiscal reform. Ordinary Kenyans felt it's something else entirely. Here's what makes this more complicated. The International Monetary Fund does not appear publicly as a villain. They issue press releases about fiscal consolidation and debt sustainability. But inside the loan agreement, which are publicly available, unlike the Chinese contracts by the way, the conditions are explicit. First of all, you have to raise the revenue, reduce the deficit and hit the targets. And the Kenyan government's answer to those targets in one answer: tax the people, which brings us to the 2024. And the moment Kenya came closer to a revolution that it had not in decades. Let's stop and look at the full picture. Kenya's total public debt as early of 2026, it was around 12.3 trillion Kenyan shillings. That's around $91.7 billion. The debt to GDP ratio was 65.7%. The external debt, if you may ask, is around 5.54 trillion Kenyan shillings. And the domestic debts are ranging to ranges of 6.78 trillion Kenyan shillings. And Kenya's credit rating is actually going downwards. A downgrade means borrowing becomes more expensive, which means Kenya borrows more to cover the gap, which means the debt grows, which also means the next downgrades comes faster. This is a trap. Forget about the numbers for a moment. Think about a woman in Kisumu who takes her sick child to the local dispensary. The drugs are out of stock. The nurse explains the government procurement budget was cut this year. She doesn't know about the International Monetary Fund's condition. She doesn't understand about the Eurobonds. She just knows her child is sick and there's no medicine. Think about a teacher in Turkana, paid late again. Not because the money doesn't exist, but simply because this month, the debt service obligation came first, before the salary. And so, Parliament began debating a bill that will make life for millions of already struggling Kenyans significantly harder. But something had changed in Kenya. A generation had grown up with smartphones and no patience for the old politics. No opposition leader organized what happened next. No party funded it. No politician called for it. Generation Z did it themselves. They were on the streets every day. Nairobi, Mombasa, Kisumu, Nakuru, name them. The government responded with tear gas, then with live rounds. On June 25th, they breached the parliament. Young and armed Kenyans walked through the gates of Kenya's National Assembly. the symbol of the system that had failed them. People died, hundreds were injured, and the world watched. 3 days later, President Ruto withdrew the finance bill. For a moment, the people had won, but had they really won? The IMF target didn't disappear when the bill was withdrawn. Neither did the Kenya's debts pause. The government began looking for other ways to raise the same revenue, but this time it was quiet. Without a bill that could actually trigger protests, the system found another door, as it always does. Kenya's story is not unique. Zambia defaulted on its external debt in 2020. Ghana went to the International Monetary Funds for a bailout in 2022 and restructured its debts, meaning it asked the creditors to accept less than they were owed. Ethiopia also entered the debt distress around the same time. The pattern is identical across the continent. Borrow for development. Attach conditions. You have to squeeze the revenue and the people have to suffer. Borrow more to service the original loan. Economists have always argued that for decades this is not a mismanagement issue. It is architecture. A global financial architecture where poor countries borrow in dollars, repay in dollars, and must keep the economies open to foreign capital to do so. Where the lender always has more leverage than the borrower. Where the conditions of borrowing ensure that the borrower can never fully escape and need to borrow again. But you might ask, is China different? Some Kenyans argue that China loans offered infrastructure without political conditions, but the opacity of Chinese loan contracts, never published, never scrutinized, raises its own serious questions. Different lender, different terms, same fundamental power imbalance. Kenya did not borrow its way into this position because its leaders were uniquely corrupt. No, but maybe some were, or maybe some are corrupt till now, but the system rewards the cycle it was built to. So, you might ask the question, where does Kenya go from here? The government's medium-term debt strategy aims to shift towards longer maturities and more concessional borrowing. In plain terms, I mean, borrowing more cheaply for longer. It is not a solution, but it is just a delay. To be honest, without serious revenue growth and disciplined expenditure, Kenya's debt vulnerability is not shrinking. Kenya has not defaulted, but the distance between where Kenya is now and where Zambia and Ghana found themselves is shorter than any government will admit publicly. 60 years ago, Kenya was told that independence had arrived. What arrived was a different kind of dependency. Depressed in loan agreements, hidden fiscal conditions, laundered through budget lines. Nobody reads. The debt is not the crisis. The debt is a mechanism. And until all Kenyans understand exactly how the mechanism works, the machine keeps running. I am Damberi Yusuf.